I'm Jim Willenbring from Sandia. I'm going to be talking about software licensing today. I'm in the Software Engineering and Research Department, which I mention only because it is not the legal department, and this is not legal advice. So please keep that in mind throughout. Software licensing should be used as a tool for your software. There really is no right answer for software licensing. It depends on a multitude of factors. Some of the obvious ones are, what does your code do? Are there competing codes? Maybe some of the less obvious ones are how much institutional support you have. Can you afford to support something fully and completely and keep it at a product level? Other factors might be, who is your lawyer? And how do they interpret the law? Other factors might be, who are your customers' lawyers and how do they interpret the law? Yeah, that's not funny. Okay, so another major takeaway from this might not be your decision. That is not an option here to just check out for the next 40 minutes and think that it's all irrelevant, because it's very relevant to you. It's also not meant to be discouraging, because if you've ever run into a licensing issue that's kind of come back to bite you, you don't want to be the one who they say, well, who made that decision? Right? Because these can have some pretty serious consequences sometime. So it's not our decision. We can't be the experts because maybe some of you are lawyers. I don't know. Honestly, some of the best lawyers in this area are people who have some practical experience. I know of one, and he's a wonderful resource. But just to illustrate kind of what role you play in this, I'm going to give you an example from yesterday afternoon on my way to the airport. I was on a teleconference, and someone asked me, hey, Jim, there's this code that we are looking to have as part of our test suite. It wouldn't go into our libraries. This is its license. Can we put it in the repository? Should we do this? Should we do that? And these are really practical, not everyday occurrences. It just happened to be that this was asked to me yesterday on my way here. But these kinds of things come up fairly frequently. It turns out this was not a really difficult issue to solve. For our case, for our experience, there was a pretty straightforward answer. If there hadn't been, then you would need to elevate this up somewhere, sometimes within your project. And if you're not sure there, then you need to go to the experts in legal. But people often say, are you sure you want to do that? Do you really want to ask the lawyers? And the reason is because if you ask them, you have to do what they say. And some people have the idea that if you don't ask them, then you can do whatever you want, which isn't exactly correct either. However, what you need to do in your role is be able to craft your questions appropriately. You need to have a baseline understanding, especially of what you're trying to accomplish, so that you can give the lawyer as much information as you can. It's kind of like going to the doctor. You'd often explain, how your knee hurts or where it hurts, not necessarily, well, maybe some of you do, not necessarily ask for a specific painkiller, right? So let the lawyers help you establish a good relationship with them would be my advice. But if you don't give them the most complete information, if you don't have the use cases, the knowledge of this is my customer's situation, this is their interpretation of how things work and our inability to work with them in the past, perhaps, if you can't bring that kind of information, the natural knee-jerk reaction from the legal department is to minimize risk, to make a defensive decision. So. All right, now you can check out. No. Okay, so this talk is primarily about copyright and licensing, which kind of go hand in hand. Some more recent concerns in this area include patents and trademarks. And we're not going to go into them in detail. And if you ever run into a situation like that, I really would contact a lawyer. But keep in mind that patents can't be infringed upon, and patents can even show up within open source code. So it can be a pretty serious issue. So when you get started on a code, your code is subject to copyright on creation. So you have a copyright immediately. This is not an excuse to not put a copyright banner in there and to label it appropriately. Sometimes people assume that a piece of code that doesn't have some sort of copyright notice and licensing information is in the public domain. That is not the right assumption. A code is in the public domain if it explicitly states such. But you have to keep in mind also when you're doing this, in most cases, I'm guessing, you are not going to own the copyright to what you create, because you're probably going to be paid by someone else a lot of the time, and they will own the copyright. That may not be the case for all of you. So there's a link here, right here. And if we have time at the end, we'll go back and look at some of these. But there's some questions on this page, and the first question is, who owns the rights to the work that you create? And there's a I don't know choice if you're not sure. There's a spectrum of licenses from a proprietary license with all rights reserved all the way over to public domain, which I mentioned. So there's this concept of free software. And this gets misinterpreted pretty often. In licensing discussions, this refers to freedom, not necessarily cost. The Free Software Foundation defines 4 freedoms that are part of free software. The freedom to run the program, the freedom to study the program, or essentially that it's open source, that the source code is available. The freedom to redistribute copies, and then the freedom to redistribute modified copies. And so there are variants of licenses that capture different aspects of this and have different requirements. Within open source licenses, there's kind of a couple of families of licenses. One is referred to as permissive, and one is referred to as copylefting. And the key difference is that when you copyleft a code, then derivative works of that code must be licensed open source. Whereas with a permissive license, and we'll talk about this more a little later, you can license and redistribute derivative works as you see fit. So you may have heard of some of these permissive licenses, as well as some of these copyleft licenses. So the key there, when we start to break this down, is, well, what is a derivative work? Basically, that's modifying someone else's software. And the key difference here is that LGPL, which was created for libraries, the Lesser GNU Public License, says that if you link against someone else's code, rather than modify their code, you have a library and you link against that library, that what you are, your code that you are linking to that library, that is not a derivative work. Whereas a GPL license considers everything within an executable. So you're linking against that. Anything that you link against, that entire chain of software is infected by the GPL license. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so here is a little quiz. Again, you can put your answer in here. This is a real-world test case. In order to acquire access to the code, the recipient agrees to compile, use this source code as is without modification. If the copy of the code is downloaded by the authorized users, made available to third parties to ensure that the user agreement is followed by third parties, to send a one-time email to project@example.com describing planned research using that module, and so on and so forth. So is this an open source license? No, it's not. Okay, so this, a key point here is that this violates the freedom of being able to distribute copies of your modified version of the code to others. So there are various reasons why someone may want to put certain restrictions in play, and the point of this talk is not to say that one model is valid and another is invalid. Even within the universe of open source licenses, there are 80 or so different common ones. So all these things serve different purposes, but this would not be considered open source.
Can you remind me why just the first point alone doesn't make it not open source? Like the fact that you're not allowed to modify it at all? Like it says you're agreeing to.
Yeah. So the four freedoms, one of them is to study how the program works and change it.
Yeah.
So that computing does as you wish.
Right. So, sorry, because when you were saying like the reason that this isn't open source is because you're not allowed to distribute it, and I'm wondering, like, I thought that for me the first point stuck out as why it's not open source is because it says that you have to run it as is, like you can't modify it. But is that alone like not enough to mean that it's not open? Like, can it still be open source even with just point number one? Like
no, there's multiple problems with. Yeah, you're right. There's multiple problems with this list of requirements. We can talk more about that later too, probably. So considerations in choosing a license. You have to figure out what objectives you want to achieve, and some of these things may evolve over time as well. I'll show you a case study later if there's time where things have evolved. Compatibility with software under other licenses. This is a very, very practical issue. This is exactly what came up yesterday, really, where someone had an open source product that they wanted to add to the repository, but the license wasn't compatible with the base licensing. Okay, so here are some of the common licenses. I mentioned that there's 80 some or something licenses that are out on some of these open source websites, but most of the time you run into a relatively small set. A couple of BSD variants, GPL, LGPL, MIT. These are very similar. There's actually a tool on GitHub. If you find yourself in a place where you need to choose a license, GitHub has a tool to help you choose that. When you set up a repository on GitHub, one of the first things you are asked to do is add some sort of licensing terms to it and label it as such. That's one thing that's noteworthy because you can actually filter on GitHub and know which software is more and less permissive. So sometimes people misinterpret free in free software, as I said before, as far as being able to charge for it, being able to make money from it. being able to sell the software. We're looking here at the differences between proprietary, copyleft, and permissive. And as you'll see, in several key factors, the biggest difference here is the ability to relicense something to a proprietary license, or even anything less restrictive. More or less restrictive. There sometimes are relicensing considerations. All right, so a pretty common idea is that people say, well, I produce this thing that's really, really valuable. I don't want everyone else to go out and make money from my software. That's a very common concern. Now, you have to balance this, though. You could say, well, what if someone just forks my code and they take it over? Again, it all balances back to what are your situations. Are you familiar with the CMake build system? Okay, so CMake is an open source tool, and that is a tool that is produced by a company called Kitware. And they support a lot of open source tools and have the ability to monetize those tools through support contracts and through different means. One thing you have to be careful of with the idea of others being able to profit from your software is, will anyone actually adopt my software if I do license it in a really restrictive way? I will keep things anonymous to protect the innocent, but there's a very specific case that is known in our community where there was a product that was created and it was licensed GPL, and another one that was created and licensed less restrictively than GPL. By what I consider to be fairly objective measures, the tighter licensed product was superior in terms of its capability and in terms of its initial design. But the less restrictive licensing product has long outlived that by decades. And in this community, you've probably heard of the product that lived on. And that's because people were able to contribute to it, people were able to use it without fear of some of these commercial restrictions. And so licensing can be a really serious concern. I know that with some of the libraries and such that we use, by having an open source license that's not all that restrictive, we end up getting support through vendors like Cray and NVIDIA, and they will actually offer patches back for their systems. They'll support our libraries on their systems if users are asking for it. And if you license things too restrictively, they don't even have the ability to do that. They don't have the ability to tune your code necessarily to run on their systems. And this has even evolved considerably in the last 10 years or so. It used to be very common that people would use an LGPL license for libraries, and that has moved towards the more permissive side lately. And one of the reasons is other people's lawyers, because as we saw, a copyleft licensing doesn't force you to have the open licenses on things that link against that library. And that I believe is true, although that's not legal advice. And I think most lawyers understand that, yet they still don't want people using LGPL in a lot of commercial cases. So that's why yesterday, when someone asked about that, they were actually asking about an LGPL licensed piece of code and not putting it into a library at all, just having it in the repository, not putting it into the library, not putting it into anything other than the test executables. And the answer was, no, we should really put it in a completely different repository. And I refer this to this as a phenomenon of people being allergic to LGPL. They don't necessarily consider all of the fine-grained details. They just say no. So some companies will not consider working with copyleft software, period. Okay, so the other end of this is, what about intellectual property? What about this advance that I made? There are ways to mitigate these issues as well. Pretty common one is you wouldn't necessarily push your code out to a public repository until you get some papers published on it and establish yourself as the basis for these ideas. That can be a good idea. All right, so patents, we don't want to take too much time on this, but a lot of the older licenses are silent on this. This is another case of kind of the evolving license sphere. Before I got started in this, actually GPL licenses were pretty common, and then we moved to LGPL as fairly common within a lot of the labs work, and then now more over to more permissive licenses. Now patents are starting to be a concern here. Some of the newer licenses do address this, some of the older ones don't. So you just have to be very aware if there are any patents in the software. I don't see this too often yet. Okay. License compatibility. This is a fun one too. So this is relevant when you're thinking about, should I pull in a piece of software into my existing code base, as is the question that was posed to me yesterday. Can we bring in this piece of code? Okay, are these licenses compatible? Oftentimes, the list of permissive licenses, the Apache, the BSD, the MIT, they are considered compatible. And so you have to be careful here that things in the permissive column you can certainly use along with things that are weakly protective, which you can use with things that are more strongly protective. But you can't go this way. You can't have a BSD license and then use GPL code underneath. All right, we spoke about some of these already. All right. There are two more questions concerning the first real-world example that we had here. So if you want to go answer those questions quickly. Why would they put something like this in here? Prior to publication, email a draft of the article to this email address. So this wasn't an example that I came up with, but I've seen almost exactly the same thing, except the front end of this, where people were very frustrated because someone published results with their code and showed poor performance results relative to something else. But they said, well, gee, they didn't use all the right compiler flags. They didn't even optimize it for the architecture that they were on. They went about this all wrong and then said that my code performed poorly. So you could see that getting that out, the probability that a random reader looks at the configuration flags, and we talked about reproducibility a little bit earlier, they may not even see what all the configuration flags were. They may just see the performance results, who knows, depending on how reproducible it is. But the probability that a random person knows that that's not the right set of flags isn't that high. And so your code can get a bad reputation simply by people misusing it. So that might be a reason for something like number 4. Include in published results or presentations the proper code names and appropriate references. This one, I think, is actually in a lot of cases pretty reasonable. There's a lot of talk recently about software citation versus directly citing software versus publications associated with it. One of the specific concerns recently has been, and this is getting a little bit far afield, but you have old publications that are kind of the baseline publications for a piece of code that's been around, like some of the codes we've talked about today, for 20 plus years, and all the citations go back to those original publications, and the newer work that people are doing isn't being recognized. So there is an effort to actually get proper software citations. So I find that one to be pretty understandable, the sentiment anyhow. All right, software licenses can be changed. So over time, considerations might evolve, or maybe your goals change, maybe your lawyer changes. But this is not a very easy thing to do. When someone contributes to a code, they have a copyright interest in that code. Sometimes people use contributor license agreements before someone is allowed to contribute. That very clearly spells out that we maintain the right to license this code differently, and you're acknowledging that as you contribute. That sounds like a really great idea, but there are some practical concerns with doing that. One is, if you are working for some company and you come across some project in GitHub and they have a contributor license agreement and you have to click yes, or if there's terms that say, by contributing, I am, agreeing to this contributor license agreement. And again, not legal advice, so I'm not saying this does or doesn't hold up. I don't know that there's any case law in this area, but if the work that you do is owned by your employer and you click a box, that may not be your choice to give up the copyright to that contribution. So there can be some really gray areas. One experience I've had with trying to change licenses, I mentioned that things have evolved kind of from the copylefting to more the permissive side. And we had dozens of software packages that we wanted to change the licensing on. And this was, and not all of it's even done yet, but it's an incredibly painful process because you have to go back and first go into the code and find all of the other copyright notices that are in there and make sure that those would be compatible with the new model. So going from LGPL to BSD, we found that we had chunks of other third-party code with LGPL copyrights on it. Well, now if we're looking at moving to BSD, that's not compatible anymore. And we can't change their copyright. And so you either have to eliminate that functionality, contact the original authors and try to get that changed, or whatever else. There's also the issue that I alluded to on the previous slide where you may have had some open source contributors to the product since it was originally put under copyright. Well, the implicit assumption is that when these people contributed, that they were contributing under the existing copyright. The guidance that I got was that if it was a very small bug fix contribution, just kind of a one-liner to fix this or that they weren't that concerned about that. But I've seen the other side of that as well, that any contribution needed to be dealt with. So we adopted a contributor agreement after this, but we haven't used it all that much because of the issues that I mentioned earlier. So here's another example. There was another product that was actually going from a copyleft to a more permissive licensing model. And they had over 400 external contributors to this. And they actually went through the process, regardless of the size of the contribution, of getting agreement from every single one of them. And this particular project had a much shorter history than the previous example. The previous example had more than a decade or 15 years of history. And so going back to every single contributor was fairly difficult. This one was only a few years old. They went back and got agreement from every single person who had contributed, which was a little bit easier because the project, they could reach those people through GitHub, except one person who had passed away. And in the end, they just removed all of his contributions from the code because it was too complicated to figure out where that agreement should come from. So you can change licenses, but it can take a lot of time, and it may not be the kind of work that you most enjoy doing. Okay, so these are some fine-grained details, but there's a lot of practical significance here. GitHub has made this easier. Do you put one file at the base of your project? Do you put this in every single file? I've seen both approaches. I tend to lean towards the both approach that's expressed here. So then when we changed from LGPL to BSD on these different projects, we had to change, I don't know, tens of thousands of copyright notices within files. Fortunately, there are scripting methods that can be used to do this, but you have to be pretty careful too, because the copyrights that aren't yours, you can't go and change those. And so it took a lot of scripting and then a lot of digging to change all those copyrights. Okay, and then non-software artifacts becomes an issue as well. You'll notice all of these presentations today are offered under a Creative Commons license. There's some different licenses that can be used for non-software artifacts. So I got us almost back on track. Do we have any questions? At the bottom of the form that I had pointed you to where you answered the questions, there's the opportunity to ask questions there as well. We can take questions now, or if you want to type those in there, I will look at those over the rest of today and tomorrow and go through there and answer questions.
So you mentioned the person that passed away and then their contributions were removed from the code. What are your legal protections? You said each contributor had like a part ownership of a copyright when the software is written. What's to prevent, say it becomes commercialized and then the majority decides to remove your contributions? Do you still have, I guess, are you protected from that if you're alive, I guess?
Are you saying if someone decides to commercialize it, can I then say my contributions I want out?
If someone decides to commercialize it, but then they sort of like push you out, like they remove your sections and then commercialize, everything sans your contributions. Do you have some protection there? Can you say can someone remove your parts from a code base and then package that up and then you don't have any say in the matter?
Well, it depends on the licensing. If it's a permissive license, you can. The reason that they had to get that permission was because they were licensing that code in a less permissive, or in a more permissive way than what was originally agreed upon. So once you have a more permissive license like that, someone can relicense that to proprietary. And yeah, so that's why people are concerned about people making money off of that and such. And so one thing to keep in mind there, though it's not always the case, is that if somebody forks your project, say on GitHub, and they relicense that and they make it proprietary, they have to support all of that. Sometimes projects rely on an open source community. Certainly there have been examples of this, but it can be difficult to do that. Now they're relicensing proprietary, but there's an open source version that is available right there. what are they going to do with that proprietary license? Again, every situation is different, but sure, they could. They could take your code, they could relicense it, and rip your contributions out.
The question about your example about that disclaimer type thing that the user has to email the back before they actually publish. In that case, can you put some disclaimer in the license and still using the permissive kind of agreement?
To require that they do that?
Or just disclaim that this is not optimized for performance or something along those lines?
You could put that, well, would you know that it wasn't optimized?
Well, in some cases, I guess, you don't know what user is going to run away, do things, or compare what things to your code. So, in that sense.
So are you saying basically if someone wants to write a publication that analyzes your software and its performance, that you would put in a requirement that says that these results may not be optimized?
Right. Or some general term in a disclaimer that.
So basically, you didn't talk to the developer to optimize it, some statement like that.
I've never seen anything like that. All right, no other questions? All right.